Hey everyone, you probably know that just over a month ago in the update Firebirds, we got the first premium jet with Fox-3s in the form of the JA-37DI, or really the correct term would be active radar homing missiles or ARH missiles, but they're both used interchangeably in terms of War Thunder. So, like myself, you may have started to wonder what other premiums we could get with ARH missiles for different nations. So today I will be covering at least one plane from each nation that I think is somewhat realistic to be added as a premium. A few of the bigger nations are lucky enough to have multiple options I think are all possible, but I imagine Gaijin will just get as many nations as they can, one to start, and then go from there. I also think it's entirely possible Gaijin will just skip certain nations altogether since their options for these premiums are just so limited. Some of these I could see as early as next update, but I could realistically see them adding any of these premiums within the next year. Also, a few on this list will pretty much just be copy and paste, but unfortunately that's about as good as it can get for some nations. Also, before I start, I have video chapters in the description if you are looking for specific planes in the video. I also have a Discord down there if you're interested in joining the community, and please make sure to like and subscribe since I'm trying to get to my next goal of 2,000 subscribers. I'm going to be starting off with the US, and the first plane I think we get is an Air National Guard F-15A upgraded for AIM-120s. This is pretty much just the tech tree F-15A we have now that can carry AIM-120s, and it even has the same radar. However, currently in-game, the ANAPG-63 PSP that is on the F-15A is missing RAM, otherwise known as Raid Assessment Mode. RAM is basically a pseudo-TWS where you lock the target and then switch modes, getting you into a super fast TWS scan. This was in the game at some point, then Gaijin decided to remove it because of course they did. There's not much more to this than that. It would probably just be 13.7 like the F-15C is in the game right now. The next vehicle is the F-16C Block 30. This was one of the first F-16C variants after the Block 25, and was the first to have the ability to use the AIM-120 off the bat. This F-16C is very similar to the F-16C Block 50, only lacking in a couple of areas. First off, the Block 30 has the F-110 GE100 engine instead of the F-110 GE129, which means it has about 6 kilonewtons or so less of max thrust on afterburner. The Block 30 airframe is also a bit lighter, so that should help with the reduced thrust. In terms of its radar, it has an earlier version of the ANAPG-68, so it won't be quite as good as the one we have currently, but it will still work very well. It would get the same AIM-9Ms and AIM-120As the tech tree one has now, and while it could theoretically get better missiles, it would probably just be best to limit it to that as a premium. In terms of air-to-ground ordnance, it lacks quite a bit when compared to the Block 50. It is not capable of carrying a targeting pod, JDAMs, or laser-guided bombs. However, it still can take dumb bombs and should be able to carry Mavericks as well. The Block 30 is capable of having HMD, which will be very nice to have. I imagine this F-16 would be at 13.7 in ARB like the Block 50. Due to it lacking a targeting pod and a significant amount of ordnance options, I suspect it would be a bit lower in ground RB, maybe around 12.0 to 12.3. The next option I could see for the US would be the F-14D with AIM-120s. Obviously the F-14D can carry Phoenixes as well, and of course it would get them too. The F-14 didn't last long enough to have AIM-120s in active service, however, there was a software update they could get to give them the capability to use AMRAAM. The F-14D still has the same engines as the F-14B, so it will still have similar flight performance. The main upgrades come in the form of the IRST as well as a new radar. It gets the ANAPG-71, which is an upgrade of the AUG-9 found on the earlier F-14s. This new radar includes parts of the ANAPG-70, which is on the F-15 we have in game. If you want to look at how the F-14D's radar would perform, then take a look at the radar on the F-15E, since it is much more similar to the ANAPG-70 than the AUG-9 in terms of performance. The F-14D can also get 9Ms, although the F-14B can too as well, but here we are. I would say the best loadout would be 2 9Ms, 2 Phoenixes, and 4 AMRAAMs. That way you can have a nice mix of short, medium, and long-range missiles. Seeing as though this would have 120s and likely 9Ms as well, it would obviously have to be a higher BR, so I would say about 13.7 or maybe even 13.3 since the airframe is still a bit limiting compared to most top-tier aircraft, though still much better than planes like the F-4F Ice at 13.0. Having an even higher max BR, like say 15.0, would help a lot when balancing stuff like this. Alright, and we just have one more plane that I think is a good possibility for the US, and it's an airframe that isn't in the game yet. That would be the F-A-18A Plus. This is an upgraded F-A-18A that can carry AMRAAMs where the normal A's could not. Obviously, like I said, we don't have the Hornet and War Thunder yet, and I doubt they would add a premium before adding it to the tech tree. It seems likely the first one that comes to the game will be an F-A-18C based on leaks, but we could theoretically see a premium variant like this one at some point. The F-18A originally had the AN/APG-65, which is the same radar found on the F-4F ICE and the AV-8B Plus in-game. However, with the F-18A Plus, the upgrade giving it the AIM-120 capability also gave it the AN/APG-73. Like the radar found on the F-14D, this is also very similar to the F-15E's AN/APG-70, reusing a lot of parts and even software. For its air-to-air weapons, it should still be able to take the AIM-7, though why would you? Seeing as though it can carry 10 AIM-120s, there would be zero reason to take the Sparrows. 8 of those 10 AMRAAMs are on the wings, and the other 2 are on the fuselage. In addition to those AMRAAMs, you get 2 AIM-9Ms on the wingtips for a total of 12 missiles. So it has quite a good amount of missiles, though it is very slow with all of them. It has 2 GE F404-400 engines, which gives the Hornet 71.2 kilonewtons of thrust per engine. Unfortunately, that means that a full fuel and weapons load, it has a sub-1 thrust-to-weight ratio. Also, I believe that a fully loaded Hornet can't even go Mach 1 at sea level, though it does have a max speed of Mach 1.8 in the right conditions. It can carry various air-to-ground weapons like Mavericks, Harpoons, AGM-88s, Walleyes, and should be able to carry guided bombs as well. Unfortunately, from what I'm able to tell, the F-18A Plus won't be able to get an HMD, but it would still be a fairly decent multi-role aircraft. Due to all these factors, I would put it around 13.7 in air battles and 12.7 in ground battles. Finally, we move on now to Germany. Unfortunately for them, there aren't many options here, really only an F-4F ICE. It would be a similar situation to the JA-37DI for Sweden, just with the F-4F ICE already in the tree. They would probably do the same thing they did with the Tornado IDS and the Su-22M4 and just make it an F-4F ICE WTD-61 premium, since that squadron flew them for testing as well. It would be the exact same, just with a special skin for pre-order and all that. I know, kinda boring, but that's on Germany for only having one good option, and it sucks. Next up we have Russia, who has a few different options, and these are some interesting ones. The first one is the MiG-21 This is essentially just the same as the MiG-21 UPG, or better known as the MiG-21 Bison we have in-game already. In War Thunder, the Bison is limited to R-73s and R-27s, but in reality, both it and the MiG-21 can get the R-77 as well. The MiG-21 has similar flight performance to the MiG-21 BIS, since that is what it was developed from. It also has HMD, an upgraded HUD, and a multi-function display in the cockpit. Overall, I'm honestly not really sure what the difference between this and the MiG-21 Bison are, but they are slim to essentially none, or at least no important ones in terms of War Thunder. As for the BR, I would say around 13.0 seems appropriate, seeing as though it is limited to 4 missiles max and due to its flight performance. The next one is slightly more interesting, being the MiG-2398. There are a few different variations of this plane, so I'll just go over the best, the MiG-2398-1. This is a modified MiG-23 that has an upgraded radar in the form of the Moskit 23, which has a range of 90 kilometers. It would get an HMD along with an MFD or two, though it's hard to say exactly how many. This appears to be the same MFD as used on the MiG-29 SMT. As for its weapons, it can carry the R-27ER, R-27ET, R-77, and the R-73, in addition to the other weapons it could already carry. Though, say you were to take R-77s and R-73s, it can seemingly only take a max of 4 missiles. But personally, I would take 2 R-73s over 4 R-60Ms any day of the week. Especially with the HMD, you will have a significant advantage with the R-73s, even the R-77s at a close range. So while similar in concept to the MiG-21 I hesitate to say this should be at 13.0. While it does only have 4 missiles, I'd say because of the flight performance is significantly better than something like the ICE, 13.3 sounds a bit better. Though at that point, you're more likely to face up tiers where you fight things you just can't handle, like Rafales and Eurofighters. The last idea I have for Russia is a bit more out there. It's the Su-47 Bearcat, which translates to Golden Eagle in English. This was really just a prototype and a technology demonstrator, but all around a really interesting aircraft. This is one of those planes I really can't see being added to the tech tree, so I imagine it'll either be a premium or maybe even an event vehicle one day. The Su-47 is also one of the few vehicles on this list where I think they might just wait a bit longer to add. Part of that is its very good maneuverability, and partly due to it supposedly having a reduced RCS from a radar absorbent coating. However, it wasn't physically designed for stealth, so it would only do so much, if anything. The Su-47 is also somewhat of a gray area, since it likely was never wired for missiles from what I could tell, so Gaijin would have to pick and choose, but this wouldn't be the first time. They gave the Yak-141 stuff it was planned to have, like IRST, since it was just a prototype and never finished. I am perfectly fine with prototypes like this being added, since there was at least one flying one and it wasn't just something on paper. However, I still don't know about how I feel about Gaijin just deciding what to give an aircraft like this, but ignoring that, the Su-47 would be pretty decent in flight performance with those forward swept wings helping out a lot. The design does make it inherently unstable, but that is overcome by the computer being able to keep it flying, and that instability is part of the reason, or a side effect of it being very maneuverable at subsonic speed. The Su-47 also has thrust vectoring engines, which helps out even more in terms of its maneuverability, and due to its design, it can't have wingtip stalls, so it can only have true stalls. But while those would typically be very hard to recover from, the thrust vectoring will help you out a lot, assuming you have some altitude. The Su-47 has a thrust-to-weight ratio of 1 at the max takeoff weight and about 1.29 at the standard takeoff weight. It has two engines, which are a variant of the DF-30, with 93 kilonewtons of dry thrust and 153 kilonewtons of wet thrust each. It also has a max speed of about Mach 2.21 or 2,200 kilometers per hour. In terms of weapons, from what I can tell, the Su-47 was never really planned to have anything, but it would likely get the same 30mm gun found on the Su-27 and MiG-29. I mentioned earlier that it didn't seem to be wired to fire missiles, but it would almost certainly be able to use the R-77 and the R-73. It had, or was supposed to have, a total of 14 hardpoints. 2 of those would be in the internal weapons bay and would probably hold R-77s. I would guess it would get somewhere in the realm of 8 missiles, being in the form of 6 R-77s and 2 R-73s, or 4 of each. The Su-47 would also have been able to carry some air-to-ground ordnance like the KH-29, CAB 500, and CAB 1500. The Su-47 also lacked an HMD as well as a radar, so Gaijin would have to make up or just decide a lot about how this plane will be implemented. Because of this, I think this is the least likely out of the 3 Russian options I've shown, but if it were to be introduced the way I've said so far, and with a decent radar, I think it would make a lot of sense at about 13.7. Now, for the UK, there aren't really a whole lot of options I think are good. The first one would just be giving the MiG-21 Bison or 77s and moving it up to 13.0 from 12.3. But I think the chances this happens is next to impossible since Gaijin likely won't change the premium this much. I know, they have before. But those few cases are due to them finding out they were just wrong. The first one I remember is the M60A1 from Italy, where they just removed the stabilizer after they found out it didn't really have one in real life. I do have a unique option here for the UK tree, being the Tejas from India. Obviously, seeing as though the UK has gotten multiple vehicles from India so far, I don't see why an indigenous design would be any different. I think the Tejas Mark 1 would be a good fit for a premium, and the Tejas Mark 1A and future Mark 2 could be good options for the tech tree itself. The Mark 1A just has a few avionics upgrades like an AESA radar. The Mark 1 gets the ELM 2032, which is an Israeli-built multi-mode radar. It can see air and ground targets up to about 220 kilometers away, and it can see naval targets up to 370 kilometers or so. While not an AESA, it should still be a pretty good radar. As for its engine, it gets the F-404 GE IN-20 engine. And somehow, despite finding a PDF from General Electric, I wasn't able to find the dry thrust of the engine. However, it does have a maximum wet thrust of 84 kilonewtons at least. With this engine, it has a thrust-to-weight ratio of just over 1, which is pretty nice, but not quite as good as some of the other Delta Wings already in game, like the Eurofighter and the Rafale. Being a Delta Wing and having a fairly decent thrust to weight, you should have a pretty good flight performance. In terms of its gun, it gets the absolute piece of shit called the GSH-23, otherwise known as the water pistol. While the rest of the plane is pretty good, this gun is what you see when you look up the definition of dog shit. Outside of that, it still has a fairly decent and interesting selection of air-to-air missiles. It has 6 pylons capable of carrying missiles, with 3 on each wing. It can carry the R-73, Python 5, and the ASRAAM for IR missiles. It can also carry the IWER and the Indian-built Astra Mark 1. I would guess that if they were to add the Tejas as a premium, they would probably give it the R-73, since the other IR missiles would be a bit too good for where it would be, and the Astra Mark 1 since it is unique. The performance of the IWER and the Astra Mark 1 are actually fairly similar. The IWER has about 100 kilometers of max range, while the Astra Mark 1 has a slightly longer max range of about 110 kilometers. These are pretty similar to the M120C5's max range, which is about 110 kilometers. Obviously, you aren't going to be getting these ranges in a realistic BVR scenario. However, you still would see a significant range increase over all the ARH missiles currently in game. I was able to find that in testing, they even managed to hit a target from a range of 90 kilometers with the Astra, though again, that was a scenario really just to push the range out. However, the Astra also has a standard rocket motor we see on the missiles currently in game, whereas the Derby ER has a dual pulse motor. This motor works by igniting the secondary pulse once it is closer to the target, which increases its range. This should also theoretically provide the extra benefit of a higher probability of kill at longer ranges, since the missile should have a higher energy closer to the target. In terms of maneuverability, the Derby ER still has 40 Gs of overload, or the Astra it has at least 30 Gs overload, though it's likely a bit more. Obviously, regardless of the missile they choose to give it, if they don't just give it both, they'll still be fairly better than what we have now. It can also carry various air-to-ground weapons like the AASM Hammer series of missiles, the CAB 1500L, the GBU-16, as well as various other guided bombs like JDAMs and glide bombs. I would expect this to sit around a BR of 13.7 or so in air battles. I would also imagine it would be about 12.7 in ground RB just due to its ground ordnance capabilities. I could see it being higher here if they were to do some sort of decompression of ground battle ratings as well. Obviously, this would be a pretty cool and fairly strong vehicle, and hopefully it will show up in the game in some form eventually. Next up, we have Japan, which I have two interesting options for. The first one is an F-4EJ Kai ADTW. This Phantom was used for testing new weapons. Of the things it tested was the AAM-4 prototype, or the XAAM-4. The main issue here is that there is essentially no documentation whatsoever. There is some at least, which knowing Gaijin's requirements could mean they would be willing to add it depending on how they feel if it's brought up at one of their Illuminati meetings on how to screw players over the best. Overall, it should be pretty much the same as the F-4EJ Kai we have in game, just with the extra ability to carry the AAM-4. It could also get the AAM-3 as well, which the current F-4EJ Kai could get as well, though doing that would uptier it significantly and ruin it, at least in my opinion. As for air battles, I would put it at 13.3 or even 13.7 if the max BR were to increase a bit as well. This is partially due to the AAM-3 having slightly more pull and being smokeless, whereas the F-4F Ice has the 9LI, which has smoke. This isn't as big of a deal in RB since you have missile diamonds, but the smoke still makes it much more visible. In Sim, however, this basically makes it invisible, which means it is significantly better. And this is also assuming they fixed the AAM-4, which was artificially nerfed. In reality, it should be much more on par with the AIM-120C5 in range of about 100 kilometers. While not being a great platform for the battle rating, it would still have pretty decent missiles. For ground battles, it would probably just sit at 12.0 since it doesn't really have any good ground ordnance, but it still does have those missiles. The other option for Japan could be the XF-2A. This is the prototype of Japan's F-2 Viper Zero. It has parts manufactured by both Mitsubishi and Lockheed Martin, with final assembly in Japan. If you didn't know, the F-2 was primarily developed by Mitsubishi and Lockheed Martin since the F-16 didn't meet their requirements. Its wings are about 20% bigger to allow for an extra pylon on each wing since they wanted 8 total missiles instead of just the 6 on the F-16. Now you might be asking yourself, why not just rewire the inboard pylons in the F-16 to allow for missiles where the drop tanks go? Well, that's exactly the problem. They wanted to have an increased capability, not just swap out the drop tanks for the missiles. You may not always see it carry all of the pylons, but it can have 4 under each wing, along with the wingtip rails. The XF2 and even the F2 have the same engine as the F-16C Block 50 with the F-110 GE129. The one used on the F2 is a license-built variant, but the XF2 likely just had a standard US-built 129 engine, though they do still have the same performance. The 129 engine has 76 kilonewtons of dry thrust and 131 kilonewtons of wet thrust. The F2 and the XF2A are ultimately the same in terms of flight performance. While the XF2 is heavier than the F-16C by about 3,000 kilograms, it only has a lower thrust-to-weight ratio by 0.1 at 0.99 versus the F-16C's at 1.09. So the acceleration and top speed are a bit lower, with the max speed of the XF2 being only Mach 2 versus the Mach 2.05 of the F-16C. However, the overall flight performance is significantly better due to the increased wing size, so it can easily beat an F-16C in a dogfight, assuming the person flying it isn't utter dog shit. But it still has the same 20mm Vulcan cannon as the F-16C, and it would also be able to get the AAM-4 and the AAM-3 for its air-to-air missiles. The wingtip pylons and the outermost underwing pylons carry the AAM-3, while the 2 middle wing pylons carry the AAM-4, for a total of 4 each. So it would already be pretty good since it has more and better missiles than what the F-16C has already, depending on whether they fix the AAM-4 or not, like I mentioned earlier. The XF2 also gets 3 total MFDs in the cockpit, which is 1 more than the F-16C. It also gets a larger HUD and should theoretically get the J-APG-1, which is an AESA radar designed for the F2. The reason I say theoretically is because this radar wasn't even ready ready until 2 years after the first F-2s entered service. However, this radar was likely added onto the XF-2, which was still used later on to test new technology and weapons. While I really couldn't find anything definitive, seeing as though the F-2 has an HMD, I don't really see why they couldn't just give it to the XF-2 as well. It's also hard to tell exactly what air-to-ground weapons the XF-2 would get, but it would likely get a decent mix of Mavericks, laser, and GPS-guided bombs. Overall, this would probably sit at about 14.0 in air battles, so obviously it would have to be added after the max BR is raised. As for ground battles, once again, it would be at 12.7, which is the maximum it could be at right now at least. If this were to ever be added as a premium, which honestly I kinda doubt, it likely wouldn't be added for a while. One of the options that I think would be good for China is the F-16A MLU. Currently, China has the Taiwanese F-16A MLU with just Sparrows and the AIM-9L. However, in real life, it used AIM-120 and AIM-9M. Essentially, this premium would just be the F-16A MLU that is currently in game, but with the added ability to carry AIM-120B and AIM-9M. It still wouldn't be able to have HMD, which is a bit unfortunate. Currently, the F-16A MLU in-game only has 60 countermeasures, though it should have a total of 120. Despite being added years ago, they still haven't fixed it, but that's just how it goes. Overall, it would be a decent plane, and would probably have a BR of 13.7. Despite not having an HMD, it has pretty much all the other stuff it would need at that BR, at least assuming they give it the extra countermeasures. And for ground, I would probably put it at 12.0 or 12.3 at the most, since it still has some ground ordnance, just not as much and not particularly great stuff either. The next option I have here is a bit more unique, being the FTC 2000G. As you can see, it has a lot of similarities with the MiG-21, which is because it was developed from the J7, a licensed MiG-21 variant. The FTC 2000G is a dual-seat trainer and a light attack aircraft. It has the WP-14C, which has about 54 kilonewtons of dry thrust and around 76.5 kilonewtons of wet thrust. It has a thrust-to-weight ratio of about 0.85 with an air-to-air loadout, which isn't particularly amazing, but decent enough. It also has a top speed of Mach 1.2, which again isn't great either, but still plenty usable. However, from what it seems, this should have a much better flight performance than the MiG-21 Bis overall in a dogfight, since it has a more modern and streamlined airframe, and its engine has a max thrust of 7 more kilonewtons than the MiG-21 Bis has. It also uses the KLJ7 radar, which is the radar on the JF-17 that is already in the game. It has a max detection range of 148 kilometers and a max track range of 105 kilometers. This is a fairly decent radar, which is nice. It's just not the best, but it will get the job done. As for weaponry, the FTC 2000G gets access to the SD-10, which is also on the JF-17 with a range of 80 kilometers. The IR missile that it would likely get is the PL-9C, which was developed from the Python 3. It is very similar to the PL-8B in terms of performance. It has a max range of 15 kilometers, though again, you're never going to get that. It has IRCCM and a G overload of 40, which would be very nice. However, this is a bit limited with the fact that the FTC 2000G lacks an HMD, but from what I can find, you can take 2 SD-10s and 2 PL-9s for a total of 4 missiles, which isn't a whole lot, but it would still be a fun little plane. It can also carry some air-to-ground weapons, but there isn't a whole lot of information about what exactly it can take, though it seems it can probably use some guided bombs. In the cockpit, it also has 4 total digital screens, with at least 3 being MFDs, which is very nice. For air battles, this would be a bit lower than most other planes I've mentioned so far. I would put it at 13.0 in air battles and 12.3 in ground battles because of the seemingly limited weapons and performance. Despite its lack of armament and relative flight performance, I still think it would be a very fun and fairly cool little plane. Next up, we have Italy, with a similar case to China's F-16 in the form of the F-16A ADF. It's pretty much identical, just lacking a bit more in a few areas. Again, this would be the same as the one in the tech tree, just with AMRAMs and even 9Ms. In this case, the radar also doesn't have any TWS modes, so you have to hard lock the enemy, which is a massive disadvantage. Unfortunately, this is really the only option for Italy outside of maybe some other sub-tree options that I really can't think of. This would probably have a battle rating of about 13.3 due to it having a pretty good flight performance while also lacking stuff like HMD and more than 60 countermeasures. For ground battles, this would probably just sit at 12.0 or so since it doesn't have any ground ordnance whatsoever. France is also a bit limited in terms of options, so I just have the Mirage 2005F from the United Arab Emirates. This section will be short since this is just a copy and paste M2K5F that we already have in the game. This would get all of the weapons the one we already have does. You would be able to carry the 6 Micas and 2 Magics for air-to-air, and any of the air-to-ground options as well. It would likely just have the paint job from the UAE, which you saw in the picture, and I just personally don't think it's particularly amazing. Of course, it would still be the same VR, so 13.7 in air battles and 12.7 in ground battles, but it would still be a good plane, though if they were to add this, it would probably be a while till they get around to adding it. Lastly, we have Israel. I had two options here before realizing I was an idiot, and the F-4 Terminator actually can't carry AIM-120s like I had originally thought. But the plane I have here is actually the Kfir C10, and yes, I know the Kfir C10 Block 60 was already added as an event vehicle, but I'm talking about the first Kfir C10. This is very similar to the Kfir we got in the event, just a slight downgrade in a few aspects, and literally only one when it comes to what we actually have in the game. The base Kfir C10 will get all of the avionics of the Block 60 that matter, minus the radar. Instead of the ELM 2052 ASA, it gets the ELM 2032, the same as the Tejas I mentioned earlier. This is still a good radar, just not quite as good as the ASA on the Block 60. I'll go over its information again real quick, just in case you forgot or skipping around. It has modes for air, sea, and naval targets, which gives you a wide range of options to choose from. For air and ground targets, it can detect them at about a max range of 220 kilometers, while it can detect naval targets at a max range of about 370 kilometers. It is also seemingly limited to Python 4, which even the Block 60 in-game doesn't have, and the Derby instead of the Derby ER. I went over a lot about the Block 60's weaponry being limited in my previous video, but there could have been an even bigger distinction between the two if they were to ever add the base C10 as a premium. This also makes the most sense to me since the Block 60 has already been added as an event vehicle, and I really can't see this Kfir being a texture vehicle since there really isn't a need for it there, and it's an export-only vehicle. Assuming it gets the same weaponry as its upgraded version, this C10 would honestly just sit at the same battle rating of 13.0, since just having a worse radar that is still plenty good is not a good enough reason to move it down even further at all. Again, it would sit at the same BR and ground battles at 12.7, though personally I think that is just too high to justify in the first place, since it can only carry 2 bombs at a time. It feels like 12.3 or even 12.0 seems more fair. I feel like this would be a pretty good premium option overall, being a bit unique, though less so since the Block 60 is already in the game. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you haven't already, please make sure to like and subscribe. I've had this video planned for a couple months now, pretty much ever since we got the JA37DI as a premium, which gave me the idea. Please let me know what you think about this list, and which ones you would like to see in the future. Again, I hope you liked this video, and please let me know if you want to see more videos on the future of War Thunder like this one.